The smell of rotting vegetables and discarded meat filled the alley behind the Silver Spur Saloon in Abilene, Kansas, on a sweltering August evening in 1878, where a young woman with dirt-smudged cheeks and trembling hands rifled through a wooden crate of trash, her stomach growling so loudly she thought the whole town might hear her shame. Grace Sullivan had been beautiful once, or so her mother told her before the fever took her 3 months prior. Now, at 22 years old, Grace looked like a ghost of that former self. Her brown hair hung in matted tangles down her back, her dress was torn at the hem and stained with mud, and her green eyes had lost the spark they once held. She had arrived in Abilene 2 weeks ago on a cattle train, having stowed away after losing her family's small farm in Missouri to the bank. Her father had died in the war when she was just a child, and her mother had worked herself to the bone trying to keep their land. When the sickness came, Grace had nursed her mother until the very end, spending every last penny they had on medicine that did nothing but prolong the inevitable. Now she was alone, penniless and desperate. She had tried to find work, but every shop owner, every saloon keeper, every ranch foreman had turned her away. A woman alone, with no references and no family, was seen as either trouble or prey. Grace had learned quickly to avoid eye contact with men on the street and to keep to the shadows. But hunger was a cruel master, and it had driven her to this, picking through garbage like a stray dog, hoping to find something edible that would quiet the gnawing pain in her belly. Her fingers closed around half a biscuit, hard as a rock but still food, and she brought it to her mouth quickly before anyone could see. The taste was stale and bitter, but she chewed anyway, her eyes darting nervously toward the mouth of the alley. That was when she heard the footsteps, slow and deliberate, the jingle of spurs accompanying each step. Grace froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing her. But the footsteps stopped right at the alley entrance. Grace dared to look up and found herself staring at a tall figure silhouetted against the fading sunlight. As he stepped into the shadows, she could make out more details. He was a cowboy, that much was clear from his worn leather boots, dusty denim pants, and the wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. He wore a brown vest over a white shirt, and a red bandana was tied loosely around his neck. A gun belt hung at his hip, the revolver resting in its holster. He was broad-shouldered and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of hard work under the sun. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Grace clutched the biscuit to her chest, ready to bolt if he came any closer. She had heard too many stories about what happened to women alone in towns like this. But then he took another step forward, and the light caught his face. He was younger than she had expected, probably no more than 25, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble, a straight nose and eyes that were a deep brown, almost black in the dim light. There was something in those eyes that made Grace pause. It was not the leering look she had grown accustomed to from other men, nor was it pity, which she hated almost as much. It was something else entirely, something she could not quite name. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough but not unkind. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed almost absurd given her current state. Grace did not respond. She could not. Her throat had closed up with a mixture of fear and shame. She wanted to run, to disappear into the growing darkness, but her legs would not obey. The cowboy took another step closer, and Grace shrank back against the wall. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. I saw you back here, and I thought maybe you could use a proper meal." Grace stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. Men did not offer kindness without expecting something in return. That was a lesson she had learned quickly in her short time on her own. But there was something about the way he looked at her, something genuine in his expression that made her want to believe him. Still, she remained silent, her body tense and ready to flee. The cowboy seemed to understand her hesitation. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands as he spoke. "My name is James McCoy. I have been working cattle drives for the past 7 years, and I just got paid for bringing a herd up from Texas. I was planning on having supper at the hotel restaurant, and I would be honored if you would join me." Grace found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" James looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because no one should have to eat out of the trash, ma'am, and because I have been hungry before, hungry enough to do things I am not proud of. Someone helped me once when I needed it most, and I guess I am just trying to pay that kindness forward." There was something in his tone, a rawness that suggested he was telling the truth. Grace wanted to say no, wanted to tell him she did not need his charity, but her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly in the quiet alley. James smiled slightly, not in mockery but with a kind of gentle understanding. He extended his hand toward her, palm up, waiting. Grace looked at that hand for what felt like an eternity. It was calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who worked hard for his living. The nails were clean, though, and there was no threat in the gesture. Slowly, almost against her will, Grace reached out and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and he helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, dizzy from hunger and exhaustion, and James steadied her with his other hand at her elbow. "Easy now," he said softly. "When is the last time you ate a real meal?" Grace tried to remember. 3 days, I think. Maybe 4. James's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He simply kept hold of her hand and led her out of the alley into the bustling main street of Abilene. Grace felt every eye turn toward them as they walked, felt the weight of judgment from the respectable townspeople who saw her dirty dress and matted hair. She wanted to pull away, to run back into the shadows where she belonged, but James kept a firm grip on her hand, and his presence beside her gave her a courage she did not know she possessed. They walked 2 blocks to the Grand Hotel, the finest establishment in Abilene. Grace had walked past it a dozen times, always averting her eyes from the well-dressed people who came and went through its polished doors. Now James was leading her straight toward those doors, and panic began to rise in her chest. "I cannot go in there," she said, pulling back. "Look at me." "They will not let me through the door." James stopped and turned to face her. His expression was determined, and there was a fire in his eyes that had not been there before. "They will let you in because you are with me, and if anyone has a problem with it, they can answer to me. You are a human being, Grace, and you deserve to be treated with dignity," Grace started. "I did not tell you my name." "No," James agreed, "but I heard someone call you that when you were asking for work at the general store yesterday. I was there buying supplies for my trip back to Texas." So he had seen her before, had known about her situation, and had sought her out. That knowledge should have frightened her, but instead it made her feel something she had not felt in a long time. Seen. Not as a burden or a problem to be avoided, but as a person worth noticing. James pushed open the door to the hotel, and Grace had no choice but to follow. The lobby was magnificent, with polished wood floors, elegant furniture, and a crystal chandelier that caught the light from the oil lamps and scattered it in 1,000 tiny rainbows across the ceiling. The man behind the desk looked up as they entered, his eyes widening as he took in Grace's appearance. His mouth opened as if to protest, but James fixed him with a stare that could have frozen fire. "I need a room for the lady," James said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "With a bath and fresh clothes if you can arrange it, and we will be dining in the restaurant this evening." The clerk swallowed hard, his eyes darting between James and Grace. "Sir, I am not sure that is appropriate." "The other guests will mind their own business," James interrupted, pulling a gold coin from his pocket and placing it firmly on the counter. "Unless they want me to make it their business." The clerk looked at the coin, then at James's face, and seemed to make a calculation. He picked up the coin and nodded quickly. "Of course, sir, right away. The lady can use room 12 upstairs. I will have water sent up for a bath immediately, and I will see what I can do about the clothes." "Make it quick," James said. He turned to Grace, his expression softening. "Go on up and get yourself cleaned up. Take your time. I will be waiting in the restaurant when you are ready." Grace wanted to protest, to tell him this was too much, that she could not possibly accept such generosity from a stranger. But the thought of a real bath, of being clean again, was too tempting to resist. She nodded mutely and allowed herself to be led upstairs by a young woman who had appeared from somewhere in the back of the hotel. The room was small but clean, with a real bed covered in a quilt, a washstand with a mirror, and a window that looked out over the main street. Grace stood in the middle of the room, afraid to touch anything with her dirty hands. Within minutes, 2 men arrived carrying a large tin bathtub, followed by the young woman from before with buckets of steaming water. They filled the tub and left without a word, though the woman gave Grace a sympathetic smile before closing the door behind her. Alone at last, Grace stripped off her filthy dress and lowered herself into the water. It was hot, almost too hot, and it made her skin tingle. She had not had a proper bath since before her mother died, and the feeling of the warm water enveloping her body brought tears to her eyes. She scrubbed herself with the bar of soap that had been left on the washstand, watching as the water turned gray with dirt and grime. She washed her hair 3 times, working her fingers through the tangles until it hung smooth and wet down her back. By the time she climbed out of the tub, there was a dress laid out on the bed. It was simple but clean, made of blue cotton with white buttons down the front. There was also a clean chemise and a pair of stockings. Grace had no idea where the clothes had come from, but she was grateful for them. She dried herself with the towel that had been left for her and dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons in her haste. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The dirt was gone, revealing skin that was pale but no longer gray. Her hair, still damp, hung in dark waves around her face. The dress fit reasonably well, though it was a bit loose around the waist, evidence of how much weight she had lost in recent weeks. She looked almost respectable, almost like the person she used to be. Grace made her way downstairs, her heart pounding with nervousness. The restaurant was to the right of the lobby through a set of double doors. She paused at the entrance, taking in the scene before her. The room was full of diners, families and couples and businessmen, all dressed in their finest. White tablecloths covered every table, and the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread made her mouth water. She spotted James immediately. He was sitting at a table near the window, and he had changed his clothes as well. He now wore a clean white shirt and a black jacket, his hair combed back from his face. He looked up as she entered, and something shifted in his expression. He stood quickly, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste, and crossed the room to meet her. "Grace," he said, and there was wonder in his voice. You look beautiful." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was not used to compliments, especially not from men who looked at her the way James was looking at her now. "Thank you," she managed to say. "And thank you for all of this. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not owe me anything," James said firmly. He offered her his arm, and she took it, allowing him to lead her to the table. He pulled out her chair for her, waiting until she was seated before taking his own seat across from her. A waiter appeared almost immediately, and James ordered what seemed like half the menu: steak, potatoes, vegetables, bread, pie, and coffee. When the waiter left, Grace looked at James across the table. "You do not have to do all this," she said quietly. "A simple meal would have been enough." "Maybe," James agreed, "but you deserve more than enough. You deserve a feast, so that is what you are getting." They sat in silence for a moment, and Grace found herself studying the man across from her. In the better light of the restaurant, she could see him more clearly. He had a kind face, despite the hardness that life on the range had carved into it. There were small scars here and there, evidence of a rough life, but his eyes were warm and intelligent. She guessed he was about 24 or 25, and there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested he was used to being in charge, used to making decisions and having them respected. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said finally. "Anything. Why did you really do this?" I mean, I appreciate your story about someone helping you once, but there are hungry people all over Abilene. Why me? James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers playing with the edge of his napkin. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest. I saw you 3 days ago, outside the general store. You were asking Mr. Henderson for work and he laughed at you. He laughed, and then he told you to move along before you scared away his customers. And you just stood there taking it because what choice did you have? I saw the look on your face and it reminded me of my little sister. You have a sister, James nodded, and pain flickered across his features. Had a sister, Sarah. She was 2 years younger than me. When I was 16 and she was 14, our parents died of cholera. We tried to keep the farm going, but we lost it within a year. We ended up in Kansas City with nothing. I found work on the docks, but Sarah, she struggled. She was young and pretty, and there were men who took advantage of that. I tried to protect her, but I could not be with her every minute. One day she just disappeared. I searched for her for months, but I never found her. I do not know if she is alive or dead. Grace felt her heart clench with sympathy. I am so sorry, James. It was a long time ago, James said, though the grief in his eyes suggested otherwise. But when I saw you in that alley tonight, looking so lost and desperate, I thought about Sarah. I thought about what I would want someone to do if they found her in a similar situation, and I knew I had to help you. The food arrived then, plates and bowls covering the table until there was barely room for anything else. Grace stared at it all, overwhelmed. She had not seen this much food in months. James must have seen her expression because he smiled and said, "Go ahead, eat." Grace did not need to be told twice. She ate slowly at first, mindful of the fact that eating too quickly after starving could make her sick. But the food was so good, so delicious, that she could not help but pick up her pace. The steak was tender and flavorful, the potatoes were creamy with butter, and the bread was warm and soft. James ate as well, but he spent more time watching her than eating his own meal, and there was satisfaction in his expression, as if her enjoyment of the food was reward enough for him. They talked while they ate, cautiously at first but with growing ease. Grace told him about her life in Missouri, about her mother and the farm, and the slow slide into poverty that had followed her father's death. She told him about the fever that had taken her mother and the terrible loneliness that had followed. James listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face, and Grace felt something inside her begin to thaw, some frozen part of her heart that had shut down in order to survive. In turn, James told her about his life as a cowboy. He had started working cattle drives when he was 17, desperate for any work that would pay. It was hard, dangerous labor, but he had taken to it quickly. He was good with horses and better with cattle, and he had a natural authority that made other men follow his lead. He had worked his way up from a simple ranch hand to a trail boss, responsible for getting entire herds from Texas to Kansas. He had seen most of the West, from the deserts of New Mexico to the mountains of Colorado, and he had stories that made Grace laugh despite herself. "So there I was," James said, grinning as he recounted a tale from a drive 2 years prior. "Standing in the middle of the Cimarron River with water up to my chest, trying to convince a stubborn longhorn to keep moving. And this bull, he just looked at me like I was the biggest fool he had ever seen and refused to budge. Meanwhile, the rest of the herd is piling up behind him, and the current is getting stronger, and I am thinking, this is it. This is how I die, drowned by a stubborn cow." Finally, my buddy Jake rode up behind the bull and fired his pistol in the air, and that got him moving. But not before he kicked out and knocked me clean off my feet. I went downstream about 50 yards before I managed to grab onto a tree branch and pull myself out. Grace laughed, a real laugh that felt strange after so many weeks of misery. "You could have died." "Probably," James agreed, still smiling, "but I did not, and that is the point. I have had more close calls than I can count, but I am still here, and you know what? I would not trade it for anything. There is something about being out on the open range under the stars with nothing but your horse and your wits to rely on. It makes you feel alive in a way that nothing else can. It sounds lonely, Grace observed. James's smile faded slightly. It can be. Most of the men I work with are good people, but they are not the settling down type. They drink and gamble and move from town to town, never putting down roots. I have done my share of that too, but lately I have been thinking about something different, something more permanent. Like what? Like having my own ranch, James said, his eyes taking on a distant look. Nothing fancy, just a small spread with good grazing land and a house, a place to call home. I have been saving my money for years now, and I am almost there. Another year, maybe two, and I will have enough to buy land and stock it with cattle. I have been thinking about settling near San Antonio. The land is good there and the winters are mild. That sounds wonderful, Grace said wistfully. Having a place of your own, building something that lasts. That is all I ever wanted too. What stopped you? Life, Grace said simply. Illness, debt, bad luck, all the usual things that stop people from achieving their dreams. James reached across the table and took her hand in his. The gesture was bold, but it felt natural, as if his hand belonged there. Your luck is changing, Grace. I can feel it. Grace wanted to believe him, but she had been disappointed too many times to allow herself that kind of hope. Still, sitting here in this restaurant, clean and fed and holding hands with a kind man who looked at her like she mattered, she could almost imagine a different future. They finished their meal and lingered over coffee, neither wanting the evening to end. James told her more about his plans for his ranch, painting a picture with his words of rolling hills and clear streams and cattle grazing peacefully in the sun. Grace found herself drawn into his vision, asking questions and offering suggestions as if she might actually be part of that future. Finally, when the restaurant began to empty and the waiter started giving them pointed looks, James paid the bill and walked Grace back upstairs to her room. They stopped outside the door, and an awkward silence fell between them. Grace did not want to say goodbye, did not want to return to the cold reality of her situation. But she knew that this night was a gift, a brief respite from her struggles, and that tomorrow she would have to figure out how to survive on her own again. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for everything. This was the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. James looked at her intently, his dark eyes searching hers. Grace, I do not want this to be goodbye. I am leaving for San Antonio in 3 days, and I want you to come with me. Grace stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? Come with me to Texas, James repeated. I know this is sudden, and I know we just met, but I feel something here, something I have never felt before. I think you feel it too. Grace's heart was racing. She did feel something, something powerful and terrifying and wonderful all at once, but accepting his offer seemed impossible. James, I cannot, I barely know you, and what would people think? A single woman traveling alone with a man. Then marry me, James said, and the words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You cannot be serious. I am completely serious, James said. He took both of her hands in his, holding them tightly. I know this is crazy, I know we just met. But Grace, I am 30 years old and I have never met anyone who made me feel the way I feel right now. You are strong and brave and you have been through hell, but you are still standing. That takes a kind of courage most people do not have. I want to build my ranch and I want to build it with you. I want to give you the life you deserve, the life you dreamed of. Say yes, please. Grace searched his face, looking for any sign that this was a joke or a trick. But all she saw was sincerity and hope, and something that looked very much like love, even though that should have been impossible after such a short time. Her practical side told her to say no, to thank him politely and walk away. But her heart, her battered, bruised heart that had been breaking slowly for months, was telling her something different. Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes, I will marry you. James let out a whoop of joy and swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the narrow hallway. Grace laughed and clung to him, feeling reckless and alive and happier than she had been in years. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with such tenderness that it made her eyes sting with tears. "I am going to make you happy, Grace Sullivan," he promised. "I swear it on my life." "I believe you," Grace said, and she meant it. James kissed her forehead gently, a chaste gesture that somehow felt more intimate than anything else that had passed between them. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we will go see the preacher and make this official. And then we will start planning our journey to Texas." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as James walked down the hallway and disappeared down the stairs, and then she went into her room and closed the door behind her. She leaned against it, her heart pounding, hardly able to believe what had just happened. This morning she had been digging through trash, hopeless and alone. Tonight she was engaged to be married to a good man who wanted to give her a home and a future. She crossed to the window and looked out at the street below. Abilene was settling down for the night, the saloon still lit up and rowdy but the shops dark and quiet. Somewhere out there, James was probably lying awake in his own room, thinking about their plans. The thought made her smile. She climbed into the bed, sinking into the soft mattress with a sigh of contentment. For the first time in months, Grace Sullivan fell asleep feeling safe. Morning came with a knock on the door. Grace woke slowly, disoriented by the comfortable bed and the clean sheets. For a moment she thought she had dreamed the whole thing, but then the knock came again, and James's voice called through the door. "Grace, are you awake?" She scrambled out of bed and opened the door. James stood in the hallway, freshly shaved and dressed in his clean clothes, holding a tray with coffee and breakfast pastries. "Good morning," he said, smiling at her. "I thought you might be hungry." Grace was indeed hungry, despite the enormous meal she had eaten the night before. She invited James in, and they sat by the window eating and talking about their plans. James had already spoken to the local preacher, who had agreed to perform the ceremony that afternoon. They would need to go to the courthouse first to get a marriage license, but James seemed confident that would not be a problem. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked, needing to hear him say it again in the light of day. "You could still change your mind, I would understand." James set down his coffee cup and took her hand. "Grace, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I know it seems fast, but sometimes you just know when something is right. This is right. You and me, we are right." Grace squeezed his hand, letting his certainty bolster her own wavering confidence. They finished breakfast and headed out into the morning streets of Abilene. The courthouse was a squat brick building near the center of town, and the clerk who processed their marriage license barely looked up from his paperwork as he took their information and their fee. They walked from there to the small white church at the edge of town, where the preacher was waiting for them. Reverend Thomas was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He asked them a few questions about their intentions and their faith, and seemed satisfied with their answers. "I have married many couples in my time," he said, "some for love and some for practical reasons. I can tell which category you two fall into just by looking at you. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes He brings people together when they need each other most. I will be honored to join you in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and brief. There were no guests, no flowers, no music, just Grace and James standing before the altar, holding hands and speaking their vows. Grace wore the blue dress from the night before, and James wore his clean shirt and jacket. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her gently, and Grace felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly knocked her over. This was real. She was married. She had a husband, a partner, someone who had chosen her despite everything. They signed the marriage certificate, and the preacher gave them a copy to keep. As they left the church, James picked Grace up and carried her down the front steps, making her laugh despite her embarrassment. He set her down on the sidewalk and kissed her again, longer this time, and Grace felt herself responding, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him back. "Mrs. McCoy," James murmured against her lips. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Grace admitted. They spent the rest of the day preparing for their journey to Texas. James took Grace to the general store and bought her more clothes, including a riding skirt and boots suitable for travel. He also bought supplies for the trip: food, blankets, cooking utensils, and ammunition. Grace insisted on helping, and James seemed pleased by her practical suggestions. She might have lost everything, but she still knew how to manage a household, and she was determined to be a good partner to James. That evening, they returned to the hotel for one more night in a real bed before the long journey ahead. James had taken a second room for propriety's sake, but when they reached the hallway, he hesitated. "Grace, if you want me to sleep in the other room tonight, I will. I do not want to pressure you into anything you are not ready for." Grace appreciated his consideration, but she knew what she wanted. They were married now, and she wanted to start their life together properly. "Stay with me," she said simply. James's eyes darkened with desire, but he was gentle as he led her into the room and closed the door behind them. He lit the lamp, casting a warm glow over the space, and then he turned to her. "I have never done this before," he admitted, a flush creeping up his neck. "I mean, I have been with women, but I have never been with my wife. I want this to be good for you." Grace was touched by his vulnerability. "I have never done this at all," she confessed, "so we will figure it out together." What followed was awkward and tender and more wonderful than Grace could have imagined. James was patient and attentive, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable. There was some pain, as she had been warned there might be, but there was also pleasure and intimacy and a sense of connection that went beyond the physical. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, and James held her close, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "Better than all right," Grace said. She tilted her head to look up at him. "James, I want you to know that I am going to be a good wife to you. I am going to work hard and stand by your side and help you build the life you have been dreaming of." "I know you will," James said. He kissed the top of her head. "And I am going to do everything in my power to make sure you never have to dig through trash or go hungry again. You are mine now, Grace, and I take care of what is mine." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and for the first time in a very long time, Grace felt like she belonged somewhere. The next morning, they set out for Texas. James had already arranged for their transportation: 2 sturdy horses and a pack mule to carry their supplies. Grace had not ridden a horse in years, but it came back to her quickly. They left Abilene as the sun was rising, the town still quiet and sleepy behind them. Grace did not look back. There was nothing for her there but bad memories. Her future lay ahead in Texas with the man riding beside her. The journey took them south through Kansas and into Oklahoma territory. The landscape changed gradually, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills covered in tall grass. They traveled at an easy pace, stopping frequently to rest the horses and stretch their legs. At night, they made camp under the stars, and James taught Grace how to build a proper fire and cook over it. She learned quickly, eager to prove her worth. They talked constantly, learning about each other in the way that newlyweds do. Grace discovered that James had a dry sense of humor and a love of bad jokes. James learned that Grace could sing beautifully and had a surprising knowledge of botany, thanks to her mother's herb garden back in Missouri. They shared their fears and their hopes, their regrets and their dreams. With each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger. On the 5th night of their journey, they camped near a small creek in Oklahoma territory. After dinner, Grace sat by the fire mending a tear in James's shirt while he cleaned his rifle. The night was warm and clear, the sky so full of stars it seemed impossible that there was room for them all. "Tell me about your ranch," Grace said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What do you see when you imagine it?" James set down his rifle and stared into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "I see a house, nothing too big but sturdy, with a porch where we can sit in the evenings. There will be a barn for the horses and a bunkhouse for hired hands, though at first it will probably just be the 2 of us doing all the work. I see pastures full of cattle, maybe 100 head to start, and room to grow." There will be a vegetable garden for you if you want one, and maybe some chickens. A good well with clean water, and beyond all that I see peace. A place where we can build a life together, raise a family, grow old. Grace's hands stilled on the shirt. You want children? I do, James said, looking at her intently. If you do. I know we have not talked about it, but I always imagined having a big family. 4 or 5 kids, maybe more, a house full of noise and laughter and chaos. But if that is not what you want, we can talk about it. Grace thought about it. She had always wanted children, but the prospect had seemed impossible when she was alone and starving. Now, with James, it felt not only possible but inevitable. I want that too, she said softly. I want to fill our house with children and teach them to be strong and kind, the way my mother taught me. James smiled, relief evident on his face. Good, that is good. Though maybe we should focus on getting the ranch set up first before we start working on that family. Grace blushed and went back to her mending, but she could not stop smiling. They crossed into Texas a week later, and the landscape changed again. The grass became shorter and coarser, and the air grew hotter and drier. They passed through small settlements and sprawling ranches, saw herds of cattle grazing in the distance, and occasionally crossed paths with other travelers. James seemed more relaxed the farther south they went, as if he was finally coming home. They reached San Antonio on a hot afternoon in early September. The city was larger than Abilene, with Spanish architecture that reminded Grace of pictures she had seen in books. James led them to a small hotel near the center of town, where they rented a room for a few days while James conducted his business. He spent the next 3 days meeting with land agents and ranchers, looking for the perfect property. Grace went with him, and she was impressed by his shrewdness and his knowledge. He rejected several properties that seemed perfectly fine to her, pointing out problems with the water supply or the grazing land or the proximity to hostile territory. Finally, on the 4th day, they found it. The property was about 15 miles north of San Antonio, along the Guadalupe River. It was 500 acres of good grazing land, with a natural spring and plenty of shade trees. There was already a small cabin on the property, built by the previous owner who had moved east for health reasons. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a chimney, but it was sound and it was theirs. James paid for the land with the money he had saved over 7 years of cattle drives, and they signed the papers that same day. Grace stood on the porch of their new home, looking out over the land, and felt tears prick her eyes. 2 weeks ago, she had been homeless and starving. Now she had a home, a husband, and a future. It seemed like a miracle, and she sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought James to that alley behind the Silver Spur Saloon. They moved in immediately, bringing their few possessions into the cabin and making plans for improvements. James bought lumber and tools in San Antonio, and he spent the next several weeks building furniture and repairing the cabin's roof. Grace cleaned every inch of their new home, hung curtains in the windows, and started a vegetable garden near the spring. They worked from dawn to dusk, exhausted but happy. In October, James bought their first cattle, 50 head of longhorns from a rancher who was selling off part of his herd. It was not the 100 he had hoped for, but it was a start. He hired 2 ranch hands, brothers named Miguel and Carlos, who were experienced cattlemen and hard workers. Together, the 4 of them built a corral and a simple barn, and they spent long days tending to the herd and repairing fences. Grace thrived in this new life. She had always been a hard worker, and she threw herself into managing their household. She cooked meals for the men, tended her garden, collected eggs from the chickens James had bought for her, and kept the cabin clean and comfortable. In the evenings, after the work was done, she and James would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over their land, and Grace would think about how far she had come. One evening in late November, Grace realized that her monthly courses were late. She waited a few more weeks to be sure, and then she told James the news. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with joy, and then he set her down gently as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Grace confirmed, smiling through happy tears. James became even more protective of her after that. He insisted that she rest more and work less, and he took over many of the household chores she had been managing. Grace protested, but secretly she was grateful. The pregnancy was making her tired, and she welcomed the extra help. As winter turned to spring, Grace's belly grew. She sewed baby clothes and prepared a cradle that James had built with his own hands. They talked endlessly about names and whether the baby would be a boy or a girl. James said he did not care which, as long as the baby was healthy and Grace was safe. Grace felt the same way, though she secretly hoped for a boy who would look like his father. The baby came on a warm June evening in 1879, almost exactly 10 months after Grace and James had met. The birth was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from San Antonio that James had hired weeks in advance. Grace labored through the night, and there were moments when she thought she might not survive. But James stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement, and finally, as dawn was breaking, their son was born. He was perfect, with a full head of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air as he cried his first cry. The midwife cleaned him up and placed him in Grace's arms, and Grace felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took her breath away. James sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Grace, staring at their son with an expression of awe. "He is beautiful," James whispered. "You did so well, Grace. I am so proud of you. We should name him," Grace said, unable to take her eyes off the baby. "What about Thomas?" James suggested. "After my father." "Thomas McCoy," Grace said, testing the name. "I like it, Tommy for short." "Tommy," James repeated, and he reached out to stroke his son's tiny cheek. "Welcome to the world, son. We have been waiting for you." The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, but Grace had never been happier. Tommy was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he grew quickly. James was a devoted father, taking over his care whenever he could to give Grace a break. Miguel and Carlos, who had become like family, were delighted by the addition to their household, and often volunteered to watch the baby while Grace and James worked. As Tommy grew from an infant to a toddler, the ranch grew as well. James bought more cattle, expanding their herd to over 100 head. He hired additional hands during the busy seasons, and he began to make a name for himself among the other ranchers in the area as a fair but shrewd businessman. Grace managed their finances, keeping careful records of their income and expenses, and she was pleased to see that they were not just surviving but thriving. In the spring of 1881, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and she delivered a healthy baby girl in December. They named her Sarah after James's lost sister, and James wept when he held his daughter for the first time. Sarah had Grace's green eyes and a sweet disposition, and she became the light of their lives. The years passed quickly, filled with the everyday rhythms of ranch life. They had 2 more children, another boy named Benjamin in 1883 and a second daughter named Emma in 1885. Their house, which had seemed so small when they first arrived, was expanded twice to accommodate their growing family. The cabin was transformed into a proper ranch house, with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a parlor where the children could play. Grace often thought about that night in the alley behind the Silver Spur Saloon, when she had been at her lowest point, and James had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not even known how to voice. She thought about how one act of kindness, one moment of compassion, had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She made sure to teach her children about the importance of helping those in need, and she always kept extra food on hand in case a hungry traveler came to their door. James continued to work hard, but he always made time for his family. He taught his sons to ride and rope and care for the cattle, and he taught his daughters the same things because Grace insisted that their girls should be just as capable as their boys. He read to the children every night before bed, and he never missed an important moment in their lives, no matter how busy the ranch kept him. In 1890, when Tommy was 11 years old and showing real promise as a cattleman, James decided to expand their operation again. He bought an adjoining property, nearly doubling their land holdings, and he began to plan for the future. He wanted to build something that would last, something his children and grandchildren could inherit and be proud of. Grace supported his ambitions, but she also made sure he did not work himself to death. She insisted that they take time for themselves, time to remember that they were not just business partners but husband and wife. They still sat on the porch together in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about their day, just as they had done in those early years. The love between them had only deepened with time, weathering the challenges and hardships that life threw at them. One evening in the summer of 1892, after the children had gone to bed, Grace and James sat on the porch as usual. Grace was mending a shirt, and James was whittling a toy horse for Benjamin. The night was warm and still, and the sound of crickets filled the air. "Do you ever think about that night in Abilene?" Grace asked suddenly. James looked up from his whittling. "Which night?" "The night we met, when you found me in that alley." James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think about it all the time. I think about how close I came to just walking past. I had finished my business at the saloon and was heading back to my hotel, and I almost took a different route. But something made me turn down that alley. I have never been a religious man, Grace, but I think maybe God was guiding my steps that night." "I think so too," Grace said softly. She set down her mending and reached for his hand. "You saved my life, James, and not just by feeding me or giving me a place to stay, you gave me hope again. You made me believe that I was worth something, that I deserved a good life. I do not think I ever properly thanked you for that." James squeezed her hand. "You thank me every day just by being here, by being the woman you are. Grace, you have made me happier than I ever thought possible. Building this ranch, raising these children, growing old with you, this is everything I ever wanted. You gave me that, so maybe we saved each other." Grace felt tears well up in her eyes. After all these years, James still had the power to move her with his words. She leaned over and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of gratitude and love and contentment. They sat together in the gathering darkness, holding hands and listening to the sounds of their ranch settling down for the night. Inside the house, their children slept safely in their beds. Around them, their land stretched out in every direction, a testament to everything they had built together. Grace thought about the woman she had been, desperate and hopeless, digging through trash for survival. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. She had been broken, but James had helped her heal. She had been lost, but he had helped her find her way home. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Tommy grew into a capable young man, taking on more and more responsibility at the ranch. When he was 21, he married a local girl named Rebecca, and they built a house on the far corner of the property. Grace's heart swelled with pride at her son's wedding, seeing the way he looked at his bride with the same adoration that James still showed her. Sarah became a teacher, much to everyone's surprise. She was gentle and patient, perfect for working with children, and she taught at the schoolhouse in San Antonio. Benjamin followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a skilled cattleman with a head for business. And Emma, their youngest, turned out to have a talent for breeding horses, and she started a small side business that added to the ranch's income. By 1895, Grace and James had been married for 17 years. They were no longer young, both in their 40s now, with lines on their faces and gray in their hair. But the love between them had not faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by years of partnership and mutual respect. One evening that October, James came in from the fields looking more tired than usual. Grace noticed immediately and insisted he sit down while she made him tea. He tried to brush off her concern, but over the next few weeks, she noticed that he was moving more slowly and seemed to have less energy. She finally convinced him to see the doctor in San Antonio, and the news was not good. James had a problem with his heart, the doctor said, likely a result of years of hard work and physical strain. He needed to take it easier, to let others do the heavy labor. James was furious at first, railing against the idea that he was growing old and weak. But Grace sat him down and spoke to him plainly. "You have worked hard your entire life, James McCoy, and you have built something incredible, but you are no use to this family dead. We need you here with us for as many years as God will give us. So you are going to listen to the doctor, and you are going to let Tommy and Benjamin handle the harder work. You can supervise, you can make decisions, but you are not going to kill yourself trying to prove you are still 25 years old." James stared at her for a long moment, and then he laughed, a rueful sound. "When did you get so bossy?" "I have always been bossy," Grace retorted. "You were just too in love to notice." "Still am," James said, pulling her into his arms. "Too in love to notice much of anything except how lucky I am to have you." James did as the doctor ordered, though it clearly pained him to step back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch. But Tommy and Benjamin were more than capable of handling things, and the ranch continued to prosper. James took up new hobbies, spending time with his grandchildren, who were starting to arrive as his children married and had families of their own. He taught them to fish in the river and told them stories about the old days, about cattle drives and stampedes, and the time he had seen a tornado touch down on the plains. Grace watched her husband adapt to this new phase of his life, and she fell in love with him all over again. He was gentler now, more reflective, and he seemed to appreciate every moment in a way he had not when he was younger and always focused on the next goal. In the spring of 1898, Grace and James celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a party, inviting friends and neighbors from miles around. The ranch house was filled with people, with laughter and music and good food. Grace wore a new dress that Emma had made for her, and James wore his best suit. They danced together in the parlor, moving to the music of a fiddle played by one of the ranch hands. 20 years, James murmured in her ear as they swayed together. "It feels like a lifetime and like no time at all, both at once." "I know what you mean," Grace said. She rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "I love you, James McCoy, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," James said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I have had 20 years to practice," Grace replied. They continued to dance, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, by the friends they had made and the life they had built. Grace closed her eyes and let herself be swept up in the moment, in the perfect contentment of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The years after that were peaceful ones. The ranch continued to thrive under Tommy and Benjamin's management. Sarah had 3 children of her own, and she brought them to visit every Sunday. Emma's horse breeding business grew until it was nearly as profitable as the cattle operation. Grace became a grandmother many times over, and she loved every minute of it. She baked cookies with her grandchildren, told them stories, and spoiled them the way grandmothers are supposed to. James's health remained stable as long as he did not overexert himself. He had a few scares over the years, moments when his heart would act up and Grace would fear the worst. But each time he recovered, and they were given more time together. In the summer of 1903, on a hot July afternoon, Grace and James sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were both in their 50s now, their children grown and their grandchildren numerous. The ranch sprawled around them, a thriving enterprise that employed dozens of people and provided a good living for their entire family. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked suddenly. Grace looked at him in surprise. "Regret what?" "Saying yes to me that night in Abilene. Marrying a man you barely knew and following him to Texas. Do you ever wish you had made a different choice?" Grace thought about it seriously, because James deserved a serious answer. She thought about the life she might have had if she had refused his offer. She probably would have died in Abilene, alone and forgotten, or she might have survived somehow, found work eventually, scraped by on her own. But she would never have known this life, this love, this family. Not for a single second, she said firmly. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, James McCoy. You and our children and this ranch and every moment we have shared. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. James smiled, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes. Good, because I would too. Finding you in that alley was the luckiest moment of my life. Everything good I have came from that moment, from the choice to help you. You made me a better man, Grace. You made me want to be better. Grace took his hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture as familiar as breathing. They sat in silence, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The land they had built together stretched out before them, solid and enduring, a legacy for their children and their children's children. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, one by one, in the vast Texas sky, Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt a profound sense of peace. She thought about that desperate, starving woman in the alley and the kind cowboy who had taken her hand and led her to his table. She thought about all the moments that had followed. The wedding, the journey to Texas, the building of their ranch, the birth of their children, the joys and sorrows and everyday miracles of a life shared with someone you love. Thank you, she whispered. For what? James asked. For seeing me when I was invisible, for choosing me when no one else would, for loving me when I could not love myself, for giving me a home and a family and a reason to wake up every morning, for everything. James kissed the top of her head. The pleasure has been all mine, Mrs. McCoy. They sat together on the porch until the night grew cool and it was time to go inside. James stood first, his movements slower than they used to be but still steady, and he helped Grace to her feet. They walked into their home hand in hand, past the photographs on the walls that chronicled their life together, past the toys left behind by grandchildren, past the comfortable furniture they had chosen together over the years. In their bedroom, they prepared for sleep with the ease of long practice. Grace brushed out her hair, now more gray than brown, while James changed into his nightshirt. They climbed into bed together, and James pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist. It was how they had slept for 25 years, and Grace could not imagine sleeping any other way. I love you, James murmured in the darkness. I love you too, Grace replied. She closed her eyes, warm and safe in her husband's embrace, and drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face. Outside, the Texas night was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant cattle, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of time in a universe that was vast and mysterious and full of unexpected grace. The years continued their steady march forward, bringing with them all the complexities of life. Tommy and Rebecca had 4 children, and the oldest, a boy named James after his grandfather, showed remarkable talent as a horseman. Benjamin married a woman from San Antonio named Maria, and they had 3 daughters who were as tough as any cowboy on the ranch. Sarah's children grew up and started families of their own. Emma married later in life, at 30, to a horse trader from New Mexico, and they had twin boys who kept everyone on their toes. Grace and James settled into the role of patriarch and matriarch of their growing clan. They were consulted on every major decision, from business matters to family disputes. Grace found that she had a talent for mediating disagreements, and James's experience and wisdom were valued by everyone who knew him. They had built not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of love and loyalty that bound their family together. In 1908, when Grace was 52 and James was 55, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a huge party that lasted 2 days. Family came from all over Texas, and friends arrived from as far away as Kansas. There was music and dancing, storytelling and laughter. Grace wore a beautiful dress that her daughters had commissioned from a dressmaker in San Antonio, and James wore a new suit that made him look almost as handsome as he had on their wedding day. During the party, Tommy stood up and made a speech. "I want to thank my parents," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Not just for raising us and providing for us, but for showing us what love looks like. They have been married for 30 years, and in all that time, I have never heard them say a cruel word to each other. I have seen them support each other through hard times and celebrate together during good times. They have taught us that a marriage is a partnership, that love is a choice you make every day. Pa, Ma, thank you for the example you have set. We are all better people because of you." The crowd erupted in applause, and Grace found herself crying happy tears. James squeezed her hand, and she knew he was equally moved. They had worked so hard to build this life, and to see it bearing fruit in their children and grandchildren was the greatest reward they could have asked for. As the night wore on and the party continued, Grace found a quiet moment to step outside and look up at the stars. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from that alley in Abilene to this moment surrounded by love and family. It had not always been easy. There had been years of drought that nearly bankrupted them, illnesses that claimed neighbors and friends, disagreements and disappointments and moments of doubt. But through it all, she and James had stood together, and that had made all the difference. "There you are," James said, stepping out onto the porch beside her. "I wondered where you had gone." "Just taking a moment," Grace said. "Thinking about how blessed we are." "We are indeed," James agreed. He slipped his arm around her waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "You know, Grace, I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I had not gone down that alley that night. I probably would have made my money and bought my ranch eventually. But I would have been alone. All of this, all the love and family and joy would not exist." "It is a sobering thought. But you did go down that alley," Grace pointed out, "and I did say yes to you, and here we are 30 years later with a family that loves us and a life we can be proud of. That is not chance, James. That is a miracle." "You are the miracle," James said softly. "You took a broken-down cowboy with big dreams and not much else, and you helped him build something that will last long after we are gone. Our children will carry on what we started, and their children after them. We have created something immortal, Grace. That is your doing as much as mine." Grace turned in his arms so she could look up at him. Even after 30 years, the sight of his face still made her heart skip a beat. The years had been kind to him, adding character rather than stealing his looks. His hair was almost entirely gray now, and there were deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but those eyes still held the same warmth and intelligence she had fallen in love with. "We did it together," she insisted. "Everything we have accomplished, we did as partners." "That is what marriage is, James. Two people working toward the same goal, supporting each other, loving each other through the good and the bad. We figured that out early, and it has served us well." James cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss that held 30 years of love and commitment. When they finally pulled apart, Grace was breathless. "Come on," James said, taking her hand. "Let us go back to our party. Our family is waiting." They walked back inside together, ready to rejoin the celebration. The following years brought both joy and sorrow, as life inevitably does. In 1910, Grace's eldest son Tommy died in a riding accident. He was only 31 years old, and his death devastated the entire family. Grace and James mourned their son deeply, supporting his widow Rebecca and their 4 children through the terrible grief. It was the hardest thing Grace had ever endured, losing a child, and there were days when she did not think she could bear it. But James was there, holding her when she cried, listening when she needed to talk, giving her space when she needed to be alone. And slowly, painfully, they learned to live with the loss. Tommy's death brought the family closer together. Benjamin stepped up to take over more of the ranch operations, working alongside his nephew James, Tommy's oldest son, to keep the business running smoothly. The family rallied around Rebecca, making sure she and her children were cared for. Grace threw herself into helping with her grandchildren, finding solace in their innocence and their needs. In 1912, Sarah's husband died of pneumonia, leaving her a widow with 3 children. Sarah moved back to the ranch with her family, and Grace welcomed them with open arms. The house, which had seemed too quiet after the children had grown and moved out, was suddenly full of life again. Grace loved having her grandchildren around, loved the noise and the chaos and the constant activity. James's health continued to decline gradually. He had a more serious heart episode in 1913 that left him weakened for months. The doctor warned Grace that James needed to take things very easy, that another attack could be fatal. Grace watched over her husband fiercely, making sure he rested and did not overexert himself. James chafed at the restrictions, but complied because he knew how much his continued presence meant to Grace and their family. Despite his health issues, James remained mentally sharp and engaged. He spent his days sitting on the porch, supervising the ranch operations from a distance, playing with his great-grandchildren who had started to arrive, and reading the books Grace borrowed for him from the library in San Antonio. In the evenings, he and Grace would still sit together, holding hands and talking about their day. Those quiet moments together were precious to both of them, a reminder of all they had built and all they meant to each other. In the spring of 1915, Grace woke one morning to find James still asleep beside her, which was unusual. He was always an early riser, up before dawn to watch the sunrise. She reached over to touch his shoulder, intending to wake him, and felt immediately that something was wrong. His skin was cold, his body still. Grace's heart seized with understanding and denial all at once. "James," she whispered, shaking him gently. "James, wake up." But he did not wake up. He had died in his sleep peacefully with no pain or suffering. Grace sat beside him in their bed, holding his hand, and she felt as if the world had stopped turning. For 37 years, James had been her partner, her love, her whole heart. And now he was gone. The family rallied around Grace in her grief. Her children took care of the funeral arrangements, organized the service, and dealt with all the practical matters that followed a death. Half of Texas seemed to turn out for James McCoy's funeral. He had been respected and liked, known as a fair man and a good neighbor, and people came from miles around to pay their respects. Grace stood at his graveside, flanked by her children and grandchildren, and listened as the preacher spoke about James's life and his character. But the words seemed to wash over her without meaning. All she could think about was the empty space beside her where James should have been standing, the absence of his hand in hers, the silence where his voice should have been. In the days and weeks that followed, Grace moved through her life like a ghost. She did what needed to be done, cared for her family, managed the household, but there was a hollowness inside her that nothing seemed to fill. She missed James with an intensity that was almost physical, an ache that never entirely went away. But slowly, very slowly, Grace began to heal. Her children and grandchildren needed her, and she found purpose in caring for them. She took comfort in the ranch James had built, in the legacy he had left behind. She looked at her children and saw his smile, his stubbornness, his kindness. She held her grandchildren and great-grandchildren and knew that part of James lived on in them. Grace lived for another 8 years after James died. She remained active and engaged, the matriarch of the McCoy family, respected and loved by all who knew her. She told stories about James to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive. She made sure that her grandchildren and great-grandchildren knew who he was, what he had done, and what he had meant to her and to all of them. On a warm June evening in 1923, Grace sat on the porch of the ranch house, the same porch where she and James had spent countless evenings together. She was 70 years old now, and she knew her time was growing short. She had been feeling tired lately, her body wearing down after a long and full life. But she was not afraid. She had lived well, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would endure. As the sun set over the land she and James had built together, Grace closed her eyes and thought about that night in Abilene, 45 years ago. She thought about the desperate, starving woman she had been and the kind cowboy who had taken her hand and changed her life forever. She thought about their wedding, their journey to Texas, the building of their ranch. She thought about their children, the joys and sorrows they had shared, the life they had created together. Grace felt a presence beside her, though the porch was empty. She could almost feel James's hand in hers, could almost hear his voice whispering in her ear. She smiled, feeling a peace settle over her that she had not felt since his death. "I am coming, my love," she whispered to the gathering darkness. "Wait for me just a little longer." Grace Sullivan McCoy died peacefully in her sleep that night, surrounded by the family she and James had created. She was laid to rest beside her husband, under the vast Texas sky they had both loved. On her headstone, beneath her name and dates, her children had inscribed a simple message. "Beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she taught us what love looks like." The ranch continued to thrive under the management of her children and grandchildren. The McCoy name became synonymous with fair dealing and quality cattle, and the family prospered for generations. And always, in the stories they told and the values they upheld, there was the memory of James and Grace, the cowboy and the woman he found digging through trash, whose love had built an empire and a family that would endure long after they were gone. Years turned into decades, and the world changed in ways James and Grace could never have imagined. Cars replaced horses, electricity came to the ranch, and Texas grew from a rough frontier into a modern state. But through all the changes, the McCoy Ranch remained, a testament to what two people could build when they loved each other and worked together toward a common dream. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings when the sun was setting over the land, the old-timers would swear they could see two figures sitting on the porch of the ranch house, holding hands and watching the sky change colors. They said it was James and Grace McCoy, still together even in death, still watching over the land and the family they had created. It was just a story, of course, a romantic tale told around campfires and dinner tables. But like all the best stories, it held a kernel of truth. That love, real love, the kind that James and Grace had found in that alley in Abilene so many years ago, never truly dies. It lives on in the people who remember it, in the family it creates, and in the legacy it leaves behind. And that legacy would endure as long as there were McCoys working the land, loving their families, and remembering the story of how it all began with a cowboy who saw a woman in need and decided to help, and a woman who was brave enough to trust him and say yes to a future she had never dared to dream of.